Let's bring in Antony Loewenstein. He's an independent journalist and author of The Palestine Laboratory. He joins us live from Sydney. Good to have you back, Antony. So now that Israel has finally given this deal the green light, what do you make of it there, especially now that we could see a pause in the fighting and much more desperately needed humanitarian aid getting into Gaza?
Well, anyone who's sane obviously welcomes this deal. It's good for, obviously, the hostages held by Hamas and other militant groups, and also, of course, large numbers of Palestinians who have been held often for years by Israel in their prisons. And one thing, of course, that is worth noting is that the Israeli government and many Israeli commentators have said very clearly that there's no intention to stop the war. I don't mean to sort of put a dampener on the announcement, which I welcome and anyone would welcome it, but the idea that Israel will stop permanently this war at the end of 4 or 5 days is sadly, I think, unlikely. And in fact, Israel has been saying in the last 24 hours, if this deal was passed, which we now know it was, that they intend to, in fact, strengthen and deepen their fighting in the south of Gaza at the end of these 4 or 5 days.
Yeah, Antony, that's an important point you're making. We'll come back to that in a second, because there are some reports that suggest Israel's military didn't want this hostage deal. They wanted to push ahead with the ground offensive and not lose momentum. What does a pause mean then for the tempo of Israel's military operations?
I mean, the main thing, of course, a tempo or a stop, or I guess, or temporary halt, is that it allows Palestinians to breathe. It allows Palestinians in Gaza to potentially find maybe some kind of shelter. I mean, let's be clear. The UN says that 1.7 million Palestinians, and there are only 2.3 million in Gaza, have no real serious place to go. Many of their homes have been destroyed. The northern part of Gaza is essentially uninhabitable. And you have to say that's, in fact, the goal. So the fear to me moving forward here is that if the north of Gaza is mostly uninhabitable, if the south in the coming months is similarly so, where do all these Palestinians go beyond the nightmare scenario, which is somehow being pushed into neighbouring Egypt or elsewhere? But in the short term, in the coming days, more aid will come in, more fuel, hopefully more medical supplies. Seriously sick Palestinians or injured can hopefully be removed via Rafah on the Egyptian side to medical care. But beyond that, I think in these coming days of pause, there needs to be massive pressure on Israel to not recommence at the end of this period.
Antony, let's just stay with that point for a second that you made earlier. Israel's Prime Minister saying any deal won't stop the war effort or change his goal to eliminate Hamas. Once the ceasefire is over, do they then just flick a switch and go back to the fighting? And does a pause in the fighting change the political dynamic for Netanyahu, do you think?
Look, within Israel, it's important to note Netanyahu is unbelievably unpopular, even amongst many of his former supporters. And there's massive pressure both within his own cabinet, including some on the far right who, I note, voted against this truce of sorts, although many, of course, supported it. Within the Israeli public, the Israeli Jewish public, all public opinion polls reflect that, yes, they want to get the hostages back, understandably, but in fact they also want a deepening and acceleration of the war. There's no massive public support, tragically, for any kind of serious ceasefire or truce long-term with Hamas. In fact, there's the opposite. There's a desire. In fact, there was a public opinion poll a few days ago that found nearly half of Israeli Jews want to build settlements again back in Gaza. That's the political mood that exists within Israel at the moment.
Just a final thought to you, Antony. We've seen this growing international diplomatic effort to push for a ceasefire in Gaza. How do you see this specific hostage deal paving the way, perhaps, for a much broader pause and any future exchanges of both Israeli and Palestinian prisoners? Because if there's any violation of this pause, all bets are off, I suppose.
Exactly. And I think it's important to note that we still don't really actually know the exact number of hostages that Hamas and other militant groups have. We're told around 240. There are literally thousands and thousands of Palestinians in Israeli prisons, many of whom are there without charge, indefinitely held for years. I know some of them will be released, hopefully, in the coming week or so. But I think without massive international pressure to resolve, it's not just to end the war, but actually to release huge numbers of people on both sides, the resumption of the war will happen. And ultimately, I think Israel at the moment will not accept, and the US frankly supports this because they're sending huge amounts of weapons to back this up, of Hamas existing in any kind of military sense in Gaza, which is arguably only going to bring more destruction in the long term and suffering for Palestinians in Gaza at the moment.
All right, Antony Loewenstein, always good to get your thoughts and your analysis, Antony. Many thanks for your time.
Thank you.